I'm constantly trying to create a scenario in which I feel uncomfortable, for better or worse. Sometimes it leads down a path which produces something that's not very fruitful, but I find that I try to resist putting myself in some sort of box. My process is sort of, I think about like research and trying to acquire knowledge that I don't have, and then seeing if I can then use that in a piece. So in a way, I guess my pieces are kind of experiments. For me, using the keyboard or the piano is an attachment to acoustic sound. For some reason, if I'm solely composing at the computer, I have a very hard time attaching to the sounds in an emotional way. There's something about the resonance of a real instrument, and it's sort of how it lives in the space, or how it lives in a room, and how the sound moves and how it develops, that really, for me, feels very emotional. So when I arrived in St. Louis to start at WashU was the summer of 2014 in August, when sort of the events in Ferguson unfolded. And this was a completely new experience to me. Someone who's grown up in a rural area, moving to a city, there's no way that that basically couldn't have affected what I was working on. And so at the time I was composing a piano quartet, and I was basically finishing that piece, and the events that were going on just really were so devastating that I couldn't end the piece basically lightheartedly. So all of a sudden the piece just sort of ruptures and becomes very heavy at the end. And so that's the first time I think that a life event has directly affected the trajectory of a composition that I was working on. On the other side of the spectrum, and more recently, I composed a series of short pieces for a local group called the Chamber Project St. Louis, and they were based on illustrations by a friend of mine named Mark Rosenthal. And Mark is a brilliant illustrator, and so I thought, okay, now what if I take those illustrations of his and try to lend some element of composition to that, to also add maybe another layer of depth to it. So right now we're sitting in the Tietjens Electronic Music Lab here at WashU, and when I arrived, part of my skill set as a composer is doing a lot of electronic music, and so I expressed to them that I wanted to try to maybe develop a curriculum for electronic music. And right now I'm teaching a course called Interactivity and Digital Signal Processing. Students are making really interesting stuff. Got a lot of people from engineering and computer science bringing them into music and think about how they could express themselves through technology. The computer is definitely a tool for creative expression, a tool that is becoming more and more like an instrument. I've heard people say that they think of the computer or the laptop as the 21st century folk instrument. Learning how to use the computer, this tool, in an expressive, artistic way is really important, so that we don't basically become slaves to it at some point. I consider it really to be a great privilege to have chosen this path of composition and music composition as something I get to sort of do with my time.